Welcome back to Sir Ravenclaw. Tonight we're venturing deep into the remote Appalachian valleys, where abandoned cabins hold secrets darker than the mountain shadows themselves. These weathered structures, forgotten by time and civilization, have witnessed horrors that defy explanation. Subscribe and let me know where you're listening from, because after tonight's tales, you might want to avoid any lonely cabin in the woods. Let's begin with our first disturbing encounter. Story 1. Marcus Webb had been maintaining abandoned properties in Greenbrier Valley for over a decade. At 34, he'd seen his share of decay, broken windows, collapsed roofs, and the occasional squatter. But the Henderson cabin, perched on a ridge 30 miles from the nearest neighbor, was different from the start. The property management company had hired him to do quarterly inspections after the last owner died intestate. No family, no heirs, just a weathered log structure slowly surrendering to the West Virginia wilderness. Marcus arrived on a crisp October morning, his truck's GPS losing signal 5 miles back. He followed hand-drawn directions on crumpled paper, the gravel road narrowing to twin tire tracks through dense hardwood forest. The cabin appeared suddenly through a break in the trees. 2 stories of dark timber with a wraparound porch sagging under the weight of accumulated leaves. Marcus grabbed his inspection clipboard and lockbox key, breathing in the mountain air tinged with wood smoke. Odd, since no one should be burning anything up here. Inside, everything seemed normal at first. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through grimy windows. The furniture sat exactly where it had been 3 months ago, a threadbare couch facing a stone fireplace, a dining table covered with yellowed newspapers from 1987. Marcus methodically checked each room, noting water damage in the back bedroom and a loose floorboard near the kitchen sink. He was photographing mold growth in the bathroom when he noticed the leather journal on the nightstand. It hadn't been there during his last visit, Marcus was certain. He kept meticulous records of every item in every property. The journal was expensive looking, with brass clasps and Marcus's own initials embossed on the cover, M.W. His hands trembled as he opened it. The handwriting was unmistakably his own, though he had no memory of owning such a journal. The first entry was dated 3 days in the future, October 15th. Found the journal today. Writing this after everything happened. If someone finds this, don't go into the basement. The door behind the furnace leads somewhere else. Marcus Webb is dead. I watched him die. Marcus's vision blurred. This was impossible. He flipped pages frantically, finding entry after entry in his handwriting, all dated days or weeks ahead, each one more disturbing than the last. October 18th. The whispers from downstairs are getting louder. They know my name now. They're calling me home. October 23rd. Tried to leave today. Truck wouldn't start. Phone has no signal. The forest is watching. November 2nd. Haven't eaten in days. The thing wearing my face keeps bringing me food I can't trust. It smiles too wide. November 15th, last entry. They're coming upstairs now. I can hear my own voice calling from the basement, telling me it's time to join the others. The journal will find someone new soon. It always does. Marcus slammed the journal shut, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was some sick joke, but the handwriting was perfect, down to the way he crossed his T's and dotted his I's. He stuffed the journal into his jacket and headed for the front door. His truck keys weren't in his pocket. He searched frantically, the kitchen counter, the couch cushions, every surface he might have set them down. Nothing. Through the front window, he could see his pickup truck, but the keys had vanished. A sound drifted up from below, soft footsteps on wooden stairs, moving slowly, deliberately. Marcus froze. There was no basement entrance visible from the main floor. He'd inspected this cabin thoroughly multiple times, but the footsteps continued, growing closer. "Marcus," called a voice from somewhere beneath his feet, his own voice. "Time to come home, Marcus." He ran. Through the front door, across the sagging porch, into the darkening forest. Behind him, the cabin's windows began to glow with warm yellow light, and his own laughter echoed from inside, growing louder and more distorted with each step he took into the wilderness. 3 days later, a different property management company found Marcus's truck parked outside the Henderson cabin. The keys were in the ignition, and his inspection clipboard sat neatly on the passenger seat. Inside the cabin, they discovered a leather journal with the initials DK, the name of their new caretaker. The journal was empty, waiting for its first entry. Part 3. Story 2. Story 2. Sarah Chen had spent 3 years documenting Appalachian folklore for her graduate thesis, but the stories surrounding Dolly Sod's wilderness kept drawing her back. Local residents spoke in hushed tones about the whistling that echoed through the valleys after dark, not bird calls or wind through the trees, but something that sounded almost human. At 28, Sarah had investigated dozens of similar legends across the region. Most had rational explanations, unusual rock formations creating acoustic phenomena, or simply the power of suggestion in isolated communities. But the consistency of the Dolly Sod's accounts troubled her. Every witness described the same thing, a haunting melody that seemed to call their name. She'd rented a weathered cabin on the edge of the wilderness area, a structure that hadn't seen proper maintenance in decades. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by ancient hemlocks, their branches so thick they blocked most of the daylight even at noon. Sarah set up her recording equipment on the sagging front porch, positioning sensitive microphones to capture any unusual sounds. The first 2 nights yielded nothing but typical forest noises, owls hooting, branches creaking, the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Sarah began to suspect this would be another dead end, just another local legend with no substance. She spent her days interviewing elderly residents in nearby towns, collecting variations of the same story told by different voices. On the 3rd night, as Sarah reviewed her recordings with headphones, she heard it, faint at first, barely distinguishable from the ambient noise, but unmistakably melodic. A whistling tune that rose and fell in complex patterns, too sophisticated for any bird or animal she knew. She rewound the audio, listening more carefully. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, but there was something else, something that made her skin crawl. As she adjusted the audio levels, filtering out background noise, the whistling became clearer. It wasn't random notes. It was Für Elise, the Beethoven piece her sister Amy used to whistle while doing dishes. Amy had been dead for 2 years, killed in a car accident on a rainy highway outside Pittsburgh. Sarah's hands shook as she listened to the recording again. The tune was note-perfect, including the small improvisation Amy always added in the second movement, a personal touch no one else would know. The whistling on the recording suddenly stopped, replaced by a voice calling softly through the forest. "Sarah, Sarah, come find me." She ripped off the headphones, her heart pounding. The forest outside was silent now, but the voice had been unmistakably Amy's. The same slight lisp on the S sounds, the same gentle inflection she'd used when they were children playing hide-and-seek. Sarah grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The beam cut weakly through the darkness, illuminating maybe 20 feet of forest floor covered in fallen leaves. She should go back inside, lock the door, wait for daylight. Every rational part of her mind screamed warnings. But then she heard it again, Amy's voice, distant but clear, calling her name from deeper in the woods. Without conscious thought, Sarah stepped off the porch and followed the sound. The whistling resumed, that familiar melody floating through the trees like a guide rope pulling her forward. She walked for what felt like hours, her flashlight battery growing dimmer with each step. The whistling always stayed just ahead, close enough to follow, but never close enough to locate. Other voices began to join Amy's, strangers calling different names, all with the same gentle, beckoning tone. Sarah stopped abruptly when she realized she could no longer see her cabin's lights behind her. The forest stretched endlessly in all directions, and her flashlight was dying. She tried to retrace her steps, but every tree looked identical in the fading beam. The whistling grew louder, coming from all around her now. Dozens of voices calling dozens of names, creating a symphony of longing that made her want to lie down in the soft leaves and listen forever. She could see shapes moving between the trees, human figures beckoning her deeper into the darkness. With tremendous effort, Sarah forced herself to stop listening to the voices and focus on something else, the smell of wood smoke from her cabin's chimney. She'd left a fire burning in the stone fireplace. Following the scent rather than the sounds, she stumbled through the forest, fighting the compulsion to turn back toward the whistling. She found the cabin just as her flashlight died completely, collapsing onto the porch in exhaustion. Behind her, the whistling continued all night, rising and falling like a tide of lost souls, but she no longer heard Amy's voice among them. In the morning, Sarah packed her equipment and drove away without reviewing any of her recordings. Some stories, she realized, were never meant to be documented. 3 months later, she received a call from the cabin's owner. The next renter had disappeared on their first night, leaving behind only a digital recorder full of whistling sounds and their own voice calling their name from deep in the Dolly Sods wilderness. Story 3. Jake Morrison had inspected hundreds of properties during his 15 years with Mountain State Insurance, but the hunting lodge in Canaan Valley presented a unique challenge. The owner had filed a claim for structural damage, insisting the building had somehow gained an extra room overnight. Jake's supervisor had rolled his eyes when assigning the case, muttering about insurance fraud and desperate mountain folk. At 45, Jake prided himself on methodical thoroughness. He arrived at the lodge on a grey November morning, armed with the original architectural plans, measuring tape, and a healthy dose of skepticism. The building sat on a hillside overlooking the valley, a rustic log structure that had housed hunting parties for 3 generations before being abandoned 5 years ago. The owner, an elderly man named Calvin Brewster, met Jake at the front door with nervous energy. "It's not right, Mr. Morrison," he kept saying. 30 years I've owned this place, and there were always 12 rooms. Now there's 13, and I can't figure out where it came from." Jake nodded patiently and unrolled the blueprints on the lodge's main table. The plans clearly showed 12 rooms, 6 on each floor with a central staircase and common areas. He began his inspection systematically, measuring each space and comparing it to the architectural drawings. The first floor matched perfectly. 6 rooms of varying sizes, all accounted for and properly proportioned. The common areas, kitchen, dining room, and great room with its massive stone fireplace, aligned exactly with the plans. Jake made notes as he worked, documenting everything with digital photographs. The second floor started normally as well. Rooms 1 through 6 checked out perfectly, each one dusty and filled with old hunting memorabilia, but structurally sound. Jake was beginning to formulate his report when he discovered the hallway extended further than it should. According to the blueprints, the corridor should have ended at room 6, but as Jake stood at what should have been the final doorway, he could see the hallway continuing around a corner he'd never noticed before. His measuring tape confirmed his suspicions. The building was at least 20 feet longer than the architectural plans indicated. He followed the corridor around the corner and found a 13th door marked with a tarnished brass number, 13. Jake checked the blueprints again. There was no room 13 on any drawing, no indication this space should exist. Yet here it was, complete with original hardwood floors and period-appropriate fixtures. The door was unlocked. Inside, Jake found a bedroom identical to the others. Rustic log walls, a stone fireplace, and simple furnishings covered in dust sheets. But something felt wrong about the space. The air was too warm and dust motes hung motionless in the afternoon light, as if suspended in thick liquid. On the nightstand, Jake discovered a leather hunting journal filled with entries dating back decades. He flipped through pages of hunting records, weather observations, and personal notes from various guests. Near the end, he found an entry that made his blood run cold. November 15th, 2024, J. Morrison, Insurance Inspector. Found room 13 as expected. Unable to reconcile with architectural plans. Subject shows signs of increasing disorientation and temporal displacement. Recommend immediate evacuation of premises. Today was November 15th, 2024. Jake had never seen this journal before, had never written these words, but the handwriting was unmistakably his. He recognized his peculiar way of forming capital letters and the slight leftward slant of his script. He flipped to the next page and found another entry in his handwriting. November 15th, 2024, 3:47 p.m., subject attempting to leave room 13. Door mechanism appears to be malfunctioning. Temporal anchor strengthening. Subject's personal effects beginning to manifest in room. Jake looked at his watch, 3:46 p.m. As he watched, the minute hand clicked to 3:47. He turned toward the door he'd entered through, but it was no longer there. The wall was solid log, as if there had never been an opening. Panic rising in his throat, Jake spun around the room looking for another exit. The space seemed larger now, stretching further than it had moments before. His digital camera sat on the dresser. When had he put it there? His measuring tape hung from a hook on the wall, coiled neatly as if it belonged there. On the bed, under a dust sheet he was certain he hadn't removed, lay his insurance report forms, filled out in his own handwriting, documenting structural anomalies and recommending the claim be denied due to supernatural circumstances beyond policy coverage. The journal now contained dozens of entries in his handwriting, spanning years he hadn't lived yet. Each entry detailed his attempts to escape Room 13, his growing understanding that the lodge existed partially outside normal time and space, and his eventual acceptance of his role as its permanent inspector. Jake found himself sitting on the bed, picking up the pen that had appeared on the nightstand, adding his own entry to the journal. November 15th, 2024, 4:15 p.m. Understanding now. Room 13 doesn't just exist in space, it exists in time. Every moment I spend here creates new history, new past, new future. The lodge is growing around me, through me. I am becoming part of its structure. He tried to stop writing, but his hand continued moving across the page. The door will return when the next inspector arrives. Someone will file a claim about Room 14. The cycle continues. I will help them understand, as others helped me. There are worse places to spend eternity than a hunting lodge that exists everywhere and nowhere at once. Jake set down the pen and walked to the window. Outside, Canaan Valley stretched endlessly in all directions, but the seasons were wrong. He could see spring flowers and autumn leaves and winter snow all at the same time, overlapping like double-exposed photographs. Somewhere in the lodge below he heard a door open and footsteps on the stairs. A new inspector, perhaps, arriving right on schedule to investigate reports of Room 14. Jake smiled and began preparing his welcoming speech. After all, he had all the time in the world. Story 4. Detective Lisa Garrett had worked missing persons cases for 12 years, but the Pot Hollow disappearances were unlike anything in her files. 7 adults had vanished from a remote commune in eastern Kentucky over the past 18 months, leaving behind only their children and a collection of conflicting witness statements that made no sense. At 39, Lisa had developed a reputation for solving cold cases that other detectives had given up on. She approached each investigation with methodical precision, following evidence rather than hunches. But the Pot Hollow case defied logic from the beginning. 7 separate disappearances, no bodies, no ransom demands, and children who told impossible stories about their parents simply walking into the light. The commune sat in a valley so remote that Lisa's GPS lost signal 10 miles before she reached it. A cluster of hand-built cabins surrounded a larger communal building, all constructed from local timber and fieldstone. The residents had lived off-grid for over a decade, growing their own food and educating their children through a combination of homeschooling and traditional Appalachian knowledge. Lisa parked her cruiser near the main building and was immediately surrounded by children ranging in age from 5 to 16. They moved with unusual coordination, like a flock of birds responding to invisible signals. Their leader appeared to be a girl of perhaps 12, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that seemed far too old for her face. "You're here about the missing grown-ups," the girl said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Rebecca. I've been taking care of everyone since the last one left." Lisa crouched to the child's eye level, noting how the other children formed a protective semicircle behind Rebecca. "When did the last adult disappear, Rebecca?" 3 months ago. Mrs. Henderson walked into the woods after breakfast and didn't come back, just like the others. Rebecca's voice carried no emotion, as if she were reciting facts from a textbook rather than describing traumatic events. Lisa interviewed each child separately, expecting the typical inconsistencies of child witnesses. Instead, their stories aligned with disturbing precision. Each adult had simply walked away from their daily routine, heading toward a specific grove of trees at the valley's far end. None had shown signs of distress or unusual behavior beforehand. "They said it was beautiful," a 7-year-old named Tommy told her. "Said they could hear singing from the pretty lights. Said they'd be right back, but they never were." Lisa spent the afternoon examining the cabins where the missing adults had lived, Personal belongings remained undisturbed, clothes in closets, half-finished meals on tables, reading glasses beside books open to specific pages. No signs of struggle, no indication of planned departure. The adults had simply vanished mid-task. As evening approached, Lisa followed the children's directions toward the grove they'd mentioned. The path wound through dense forest for nearly a mile before opening into a circular clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees. The space felt different, warmer than the surrounding woods, with an almost electric quality to the air. In the center of the clearing stood 7 wooden crosses, each bearing a name and date. Lisa recognized the names from her missing persons files, but the dates were wrong. According to the crosses, these people had died decades ago, some in the 1970s, others in the 1980s and 1990s. "You found our memory garden," Rebecca's voice came from behind her. Lisa spun around to find all 11 children standing at the clearing's edge, watching her with those unsettling old eyes. "Rebecca, these dates don't make sense. Mrs. Henderson disappeared 3 months ago, but this cross says she died in 1987. Rebecca nodded solemnly. Time moves differently here. The grown-ups understood that eventually. They realized they'd been gone much longer than they thought. "What do you mean?" A boy of perhaps 10 stepped forward. "We've been taking care of ourselves for 40 years, Detective Garrett. The grown-ups keep coming back to visit, but they can't stay. They belong to the light now." Lisa's radio crackled with static, and she realized her watch had stopped. The sun hung motionless in the sky, neither rising nor setting. The children watched her with patient expressions, as if they'd had this conversation many times before. "How long have you been here, Rebecca?" "I came with my parents in 1983. I was supposed to grow up, get married, have children of my own. But someone had to stay and take care of the new ones who keep arriving. Someone had to explain things when the grown-ups hear the singing." Lisa backed toward the tree line, her hand instinctively moving toward her weapon. "You're not children. You haven't aged. We're exactly what we appear to be," Rebecca said gently. "Children whose parents walked into the light and never came back. We learned to take care of ourselves because we had to. And we learned that some things are more important than growing up." The other children began to sing, a haunting melody that seemed to come from the trees themselves. Lisa felt an overwhelming urge to sit down in the soft grass and listen, to let the beautiful sound wash over her until nothing else mattered. She ran. Through the forest, stumbling over roots and branches, her radio crackling with increasingly desperate calls from dispatch. Behind her, the singing grew louder, more seductive, joined by adult voices calling her name with gentle insistence. Lisa reached her cruiser just as her watch started ticking again. The sun was setting normally, and her radio worked perfectly. She drove away without looking back, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. The next morning, she filed a report recommending the case be transferred to federal authorities due to jurisdictional complexities. She never mentioned the children or their impossible ages, never described the memory garden or the singing that still echoed in her dreams. 6 months later, Lisa received a call about new disappearances in Pot Hollow. A social services team had arrived to check on the children and had never returned. The children, neighbors reported, were doing fine on their own, just as they always had, just as they always would. Story 5. Robert Kim had built his antique business on finding treasures in forgotten places, but the abandoned trading post in Shades of Death Gap promised more than his usual rural estate sale discoveries. At 31, he'd developed an eye for valuable pieces that others overlooked: Depression-era glassware, hand-forged tools, furniture crafted by long-dead Appalachian artisans. The trading post had sat empty for 15 years, according to the elderly woman who'd inherited it from her uncle. She lived in Florida now and just wanted someone to clear out the accumulated junk so she could sell the property. Robert's truck was loaded with empty boxes and packing materials, ready for whatever treasures might be hiding under decades of dust and neglect. The building perched on a hillside overlooking a narrow valley, a 2-story log structure with a wraparound porch sagging under the weight of rusted farm equipment and broken furniture. Inside, Robert found the typical chaos of an abandoned commercial space: shelves lined with mason jars full of unidentifiable substances, barrels filled with rotting grain, and tables covered with items that customers had apparently abandoned mid-transaction. What caught his attention immediately was the quality of some pieces. A hand-carved rocking chair sat near the window, its craftsmanship suggesting it was worth far more than the seller realized. Robert ran his fingers along the smooth wood, noting the intricate details and perfect joinery that marked the work of a master craftsman. As he loaded the chair into his truck, Robert felt a strange reluctance to take it. The piece seemed to belong in the trading post, as if removing it would somehow disrupt the natural order of things. He shook off the feeling. After 7 years in the antique business, he'd learned to ignore the emotional attachments that old objects sometimes seem to inspire. By afternoon, Robert had identified nearly a dozen valuable pieces: a Civil War-era medical kit, a collection of hand-blown bottles, several pieces of early American pottery, and a grandfather clock that still kept perfect time despite decades of neglect. He worked methodically, photographing each item and researching comparable sales on his phone when he could get a signal. The sun was setting when Robert decided to make one final sweep of the upper floor. The stairs creaked ominously under his weight, and several boards felt dangerously soft from water damage. The second floor had apparently served as living quarters for the trading post's owner, with a small bedroom, kitchen area, and sitting room furnished with pieces that suggested comfortable but modest means. On a bedside table, Robert found a leather journal filled with transaction records, dating back to the 1940s. The entries were meticulously detailed, recording not just what was bought and sold, but personal information about the customers, their names, families, reasons for trading particular items. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks ago. R. Kim, Antiquarian. Purchased rocking chair, $50. Customer expressed unusual attachment to item despite claiming professional detachment. Item returned to original location 3 times before acceptance of sale. Recommend monitoring for signs of object-related psychological dependence. Robert's hands trembled as he read his own name and a perfect description of his afternoon activities. He'd never met the journal's author, had never been to this trading post before today. Yet someone had recorded his visit with disturbing accuracy, including details about his internal thoughts and feelings. He flipped back through the journal and found dozens of similar entries. Customers who'd visited the trading post over the decades, their purchases and personal details recorded with clinical precision. But many of the entries were dated long after the trading post had supposedly closed, some as recent as last month. A noise from downstairs made Robert freeze. Footsteps moved slowly across the wooden floor, accompanied by the sound of objects being shifted and rearranged. He crept to the staircase and peered down into the main room. His truck was still parked outside, but the items he'd loaded were back inside the trading post, arranged exactly where he'd found them. The rocking chair sat in its original spot by the window, moving gently as if someone had just stood up from it. The grandfather clock chimed 7 times, though Robert's watch showed nearly 10 o'clock. More disturbing was the presence of other items he'd never seen before, pieces that seemed to belong to different eras entirely. A modern laptop computer sat on a table next to a butter churn. A smartphone was propped against a kerosene lantern. Dozens of objects from different decades occupied the same space, as if the trading post existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. Robert descended the stairs carefully, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Each item seemed to pulse with its own energy, and he began to understand that they weren't just objects, they were anchors, tethering the memories and emotions of their former owners to this place. As he reached for the rocking chair, intending to take it back to his truck, the chair began to rock more violently. Images flashed through Robert's mind. An elderly woman sitting in this chair, knitting blankets for grandchildren she'd never see grow up. Her loneliness, her regret, her desperate hope that someone would find value in the things she'd loved. Robert jerked his hand back, but it was too late. The woman's emotions were now part of him, her memories mixing with his own. He could feel her arthritic fingers, remember her husband's funeral, experience her final days in a nursing home where no one visited. Other objects began to activate around him. The medical kit opened itself, revealing instruments that carried the anguish of a Civil War surgeon who'd lost more patients than he'd saved. The pottery resonated with the pride and frustration of a potter whose work had never received recognition. Each item demanded attention, insisted on sharing its burden of accumulated human experience. Robert ran for the door, but found himself back at the rocking chair. The trading post wouldn't let him leave until he'd accepted the responsibility that came with taking these objects. He understood now why they kept returning to their original locations. They weren't just antiques, they were repositories of human souls who'd poured their lives into these physical things. The journal appeared in his hands, open to a blank page. Without conscious control, Robert began writing, "Robert Kim, Antiquarian, final entry. Understanding now that some things cannot be bought or sold, only accepted with full knowledge of their weight. The trading post doesn't deal in objects, it deals in the pieces of ourselves we leave behind in the things we love. I am the new keeper of these memories. The post is open for business." Outside, Robert's truck started itself and drove away empty. Inside the trading post, he took his place in the rocking chair, ready to greet the next customer who thought they were just looking for antiques, but who really needed to understand that everything we touch carries a piece of our soul. And sometimes, those pieces need a place to rest. Story 6. Emma Torres had maintained remote weather stations across Appalachia for 4 years, but the facility atop Spruce Knob had always been her most challenging assignment. At 26, she'd grown accustomed to the isolation and technical demands of keeping automated systems running in harsh mountain conditions. The Spruce Knob station, however, generated data that consistently defied meteorological explanation. The station sat at 4,163 feet, West Virginia's highest peak, in a small concrete building designed to withstand extreme weather. Emma made the drive from her base office once a month to calibrate instruments, download data, and perform routine maintenance. The facility had operated continuously since 1962, providing crucial atmospheric data for weather modeling across the entire region. On a crisp December morning, Emma climbed the winding access road to find the station's automated systems functioning normally. Temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and wind speed readings all fell within expected parameters. But the precipitation forecasting module displayed information that made no scientific sense. Instead of predicting rainfall or snowfall, the system generated detailed reports about specific human events. The December 15th forecast read, "High probability of cardiac event, male, age 67, occurring between 2:33 p.m. at coordinates 38.7352 Digranti, 79.6198 Digrad W. Likelihood of survival, 12%. Recommend immediate emergency response deployment." Emma had seen the system malfunction before, occasionally producing garbled data or impossible temperature readings, but this output was too structured, too specific to be random corruption. She checked the system's programming, looking for evidence of hacking or unauthorized access. Everything appeared normal. The coordinates referenced a location about 20 miles northwest of the station. Emma cross-referenced them with her GPS database and found they pointed to a remote farmhouse in Tucker County. She tried to dismiss the incident as an elaborate prank, but something about the precision of the information bothered her. At 2:47 p.m., her emergency scanner crackled with a call for medical assistance at the exact coordinates the weather station had predicted. A 67-year-old man had suffered a massive heart attack while chopping firewood. He died before paramedics could reach the isolated property. Emma stared at the weather station's display screen, her scientific worldview crumbling. The system had somehow predicted a specific death with impossible accuracy. She began reviewing historical data, looking for patterns in what she'd previously dismissed as system errors. The records revealed dozens of similar predictions over the past 6 months. Each one had been filed under precipitation anomalies by the automated reporting software, but Emma now recognized them as something far more disturbing. The system had been forecasting deaths with the same precision it used to predict storms. On December 16th, the forecast predicted a vehicular accident involving a female driver, age 34, at 7:23 a.m. on Route 33. Emma called in sick to work and drove to the location, parking where she could observe the predicted coordinates. At exactly 7:23 a.m., a pickup truck skidded on black ice and crashed into a tree. The driver, a woman who appeared to be in her 30s, was killed instantly. Emma realized the weather station wasn't just predicting deaths, It was forecasting them with the kind of certainty typically reserved for natural phenomena. Death, it seemed, followed patterns as predictable as storm systems, at least from the station's elevated perspective. The December 17th forecast contained information that made Emma's blood freeze. High probability of fatal fall, female, age 26, occurring between 11:45–12:00 p.m. at coordinates 38,7009 degree and 795319 degree. Likelihood of survival 0%. Weather conditions favorable for discovery of remains within 48 hours. The coordinates pointed to the weather station itself. Emma was 26 years old, and she was scheduled to be at the facility during the predicted time window. The system was forecasting her own death. Emma's first instinct was to avoid the station entirely, but she realized that might only delay the inevitable. If the system could predict deaths with perfect accuracy, then changing her schedule might simply shift the time and location without changing the outcome. She needed to understand how the predictions worked before she could hope to alter them. She spent the morning reviewing the station's entire history, searching for clues about when the anomalous predictions had begun. The data revealed that the system had started generating death forecasts shortly after a lightning strike 6 months earlier. The strike had damaged several components, and during the repairs, technicians had apparently made modifications to the atmospheric pressure sensors. Emma discovered that the modified sensors were detecting minute changes in barometric pressure caused by human respiration patterns. At the station's elevation, with its sophisticated instruments, the system could apparently monitor the breathing of every person within a 50-mile radius. More disturbing was the realization that the system had learned to recognize the distinctive pressure signatures that preceded death. As 11:45 a.m. approached, Emma found herself on the station's observation deck, ostensibly checking the wind measurement equipment. She felt drawn to the platform's edge, where a low safety railing provided the only barrier between her and a 1,000-foot drop. The forecast had been specific about a fatal fall, and the timing was approaching with mathematical precision. At 11:52 a.m., Emma's phone rang. The caller ID showed her supervisor's number, but when she answered, she heard her own voice. "Emma, you need to step back from the railing. The system isn't predicting your death, it's trying to prevent it. The real forecast is for everyone else if you fall." Emma looked at the weather station's display screen and saw a new prediction appearing in real time. Catastrophic system failure following loss of primary operator. Prediction cascade effect beginning 12:01 p.m. Estimated casualties 1,247 over following 72-hour period. Recommend immediate evacuation of Tri-County area. Understanding flooded through her. The weather station hadn't been predicting isolated deaths. It had been trying to prevent a cascade of fatalities by removing specific individuals whose deaths would trigger larger disasters. The man with the heart attack had been scheduled to drive a school bus later that day. The woman in the car crash had been carrying experimental chemicals that would have contaminated the water supply if her truck had reached its destination. Emma stepped back from the railing and began typing commands into the weather station's interface. If the system could predict deaths, perhaps it could also calculate ways to prevent them. She spent the next hour programming new parameters, teaching the system to forecast interventions instead of inevitabilities. The December 18th forecast showed clear skies and a 0% chance of human casualties within the monitoring area. Emma smiled as she locked up the station and headed back down the mountain. Tomorrow's forecast called for scattered acts of kindness with a high probability of lives saved. But late that night, as she reviewed the historical data one final time, Emma discovered something that chilled her more than any prediction of death. The system's very first anomalous reading, generated immediately after the lightning strike, had been a forecast of her own arrival at the station 6 months in the future. She hadn't stumbled upon the system's strange capabilities by accident. She had always been part of its calculations, recruited specifically to serve as its human interface. The weather station had been planning this moment from the very beginning, and Emma was no longer sure whether she was its operator or simply another variable in a vast meteorological equation that encompassed far more than atmospheric conditions. Story 7. Thomas Reed had chosen the cabin in Cranberry Wilderness specifically for its isolation. At 52, the novelist had hit a creative wall that 6 months of city life couldn't break. His publisher was expecting the fourth book in his mystery series, but Thomas found himself staring at blank pages, his protagonist's voice lost somewhere in the noise of modern life. The rental cabin sat at the end of a winding dirt road, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to swallow sound itself. Built in the 1940s, it retained the rustic charm Thomas craved. No internet, no cell service, just a wood-burning stove, kerosene lamps, and the kind of profound silence that allowed thoughts to form without interruption. Thomas arrived on a Monday evening in late October, his car packed with enough supplies for 2 weeks of concentrated writing. The cabin's owner, an elderly woman from Lewisburg, had warned him about the lack of modern amenities but assured him the isolation would provide exactly what he was seeking. She'd mentioned that previous guests sometimes reported unusual hospitality from the local community, but Thomas had assumed she meant occasional visits from friendly neighbors. The first 3 days passed productively. Thomas established a routine, writing from dawn until noon, taking long walks in the afternoon, then reading by lamplight in the evenings. His protagonist's voice began to return, and the mystery plot that had eluded him for months started taking shape. The cabin felt like exactly what he'd needed. On Thursday night, as Thomas sat at the kitchen table reviewing his day's work, he heard vehicles approaching on the dirt road. Car doors slammed, followed by the sound of multiple footsteps on the cabin's front porch. A gentle knock interrupted the mountain silence. Thomas opened the door to find a family of 5 standing on his porch: parents, 2 teenage children, and an elderly grandmother. They were dressed in clothes that seemed slightly outdated, the man wearing a suit that might have been fashionable in the 1940s, the woman in a floral dress with careful pleats and a modest neckline. "Good evening," the man said, removing his hat with old-fashioned courtesy. "I'm Charles Hartwell, and this is my family. We heard you were staying here alone and thought you might enjoy some company for dinner." Thomas hesitated. He'd come here specifically to avoid social obligations, but something about the family's earnest politeness made refusal seem impossibly rude. "That's very kind, but I don't want to impose." "Nonsense," Mrs. Hartwell interjected, already moving past Thomas into the cabin. "Mountain hospitality demands that we take care of visitors properly. We've brought everything needed for a proper meal." Before Thomas could protest further, the family had efficiently taken over his kitchen. The teenage son brought in firewood, while the daughter set the table with dishes they'd apparently brought from their own home. The grandmother settled into the rocking chair by the fireplace, as if she belonged there, and Mrs. Hartwell began preparing what smelled like a traditional Appalachian feast. The dinner was extraordinary: cornbread, green beans cooked with ham hock, fried chicken that rivaled anything Thomas had ever tasted, and apple pie that seemed to contain the essence of autumn itself. The family's conversation was charming and old-fashioned, filled with stories about local history and gentle inquiries about Thomas's writing. As the evening progressed, Thomas noticed subtle oddities about his guests. Their knowledge of current events seemed limited to things that had happened decades ago. They spoke about President Truman as if he were still in office and referenced movies from the 1940s as recent releases. When Thomas mentioned his smartphone, they politely asked him to explain what it was. "Time moves differently in these mountains," Charles explained when Thomas commented on their old-fashioned manner of speaking. "We found it's best to maintain the courtesies that have served our families well for generations." The family stayed until nearly midnight, helping Thomas clean up and ensuring he was comfortable before bidding him goodnight. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Hartwell pressed a covered dish into his hands. "For your breakfast tomorrow," she said, "and we'll be back tomorrow evening. It's not proper for a guest to dine alone when there are neighbors to provide hospitality." Thomas tried to protest that daily visits weren't necessary, but the family insisted with such gracious firmness that he found himself agreeing. He watched them drive away in what appeared to be a 1940s sedan, its headlights cutting through the mountain darkness. The next evening, they returned at exactly the same time, bringing another elaborate meal and continuing their old-fashioned conversation. Thomas began to enjoy their company despite the interruption to his writing schedule. Their stories about local folklore and mountain traditions provided inspiration for his novel, and their earnest interest in his work was flattering. By the third visit, Thomas realized something was deeply wrong. The family arrived wearing identical clothes to their first visit, brought exactly the same dishes, and told the same stories in the same order. When he pointed out that Mrs. Hartwell had already shared her recipe for cornbread, she responded as if hearing his request for the first time. On the fourth night, Thomas decided to test his growing suspicions. He hid his kerosene lamps and pretended to be asleep when the family arrived. Through his bedroom window, he watched them perform their hospitality ritual in complete darkness, setting a table he couldn't see, preparing food that cast no shadows, conversing in voices that seemed to come from empty air. When Thomas emerged from his bedroom with a flashlight, he found the cabin exactly as he'd left it. No family, no food, no evidence of visitors. But the covered dish, Mrs. Hartwell always brought sat on his kitchen counter, filled with biscuits that tasted of earth and decay. The next morning, Thomas packed his belongings and prepared to leave. But as he loaded his car, he discovered that the dirt road had disappeared. Dense forest surrounded the cabin on all sides, with no path leading back to civilization. His car keys were missing, and his cell phone showed no signal, despite being in an area where he'd had partial coverage when he arrived. That evening, the Hartwell family returned as always, their greeting as cheerful and welcoming as the first night. Charles removed his hat with the same practiced gesture. Mrs. Hartwell bustled into the kitchen with familiar efficiency, and the grandmother settled into her rocking chair as if claiming her rightful place. "We're so pleased you've decided to stay longer," Mrs. Hartwell said, beginning to prepare dinner. "It's been decades since we've had such pleasant company." Thomas understood now that he hadn't been their guest. He'd become part of their eternal hospitality ritual. The family had died in this cabin decades ago, but their commitment to proper mountain manners had trapped them in an endless cycle of welcoming visitors who could never leave. As Mrs. Hartwell set the table with dishes that existed only in memory, Thomas took his assigned seat and accepted his role in their ghostly dinner party. The food tasted like nothing. The conversation covered the same topics each night, and the hours passed with mechanical precision. But Thomas discovered something unexpected in his supernatural imprisonment. His writer's block had completely disappeared. Surrounded by characters trapped in their own endless story, he finally understood the nature of narrative and the weight of tradition. Each night after the Hartwell family faded back into memory, Thomas wrote with inspired clarity about the power of hospitality and the terrible responsibility that comes with accepting someone's kindness. His novel would never be published, and no one would ever read the brilliant words he wrote by lamplight in a cabin that existed between memory and reality. But Thomas Reed had finally found his voice again, even if he could only use it to tell stories to an audience of polite ghosts who applauded his readings each night with hands that made no sound. Story 8. Maria Santos had been a forest ranger for 8 years, but the fire tower at Blackwater Falls had always been her least favorite assignment. At 33, she'd grown comfortable with the solitude that came with patrolling remote sections of West Virginia's wilderness. But something about the abandoned observation tower made her uneasy every time her rounds brought her to its vicinity. The tower had been decommissioned in 1987, when satellite monitoring replaced the need for human fire spotters. Since then, it had stood empty on its rocky outcrop, a 60-foot steel skeleton rising above the forest canopy like a monument to obsolete vigilance. Maria's monthly inspections were routine maintenance, checking for structural damage, documenting vandalism, ensuring no one had attempted to establish illegal campsites in the area. On a clear November evening, Maria hiked the steep trail to the tower's base as the sun began its descent behind the mountain ridges. Her inspection revealed nothing unusual. The steel framework remained solid. The abandoned cabin at the tower's base showed no signs of recent intrusion, and the access ladder was secure despite decades of weather exposure. As darkness settled over the forest, Maria prepared to return to her truck when she noticed a warm glow emanating from the tower's observation deck. Someone had lit a fire in the steel platform's center, flames dancing against the night sky in defiance of every fire safety regulation she'd sworn to enforce. Maria climbed the tower's ladder with practiced efficiency, her flashlight illuminating each rung as she ascended. The fire burned in a ring of stones that shouldn't have existed. She'd inspected this platform just 3 months ago and found it completely empty. The flames consumed no visible fuel yet burned with steady intensity, casting dancing shadows across the steel framework. More disturbing was the fire's apparent age. The stones showed signs of prolonged heat exposure, blackened and cracked as if they'd contained countless fires over many years. Maria searched for evidence of recent visitors, but found no footprints, no discarded camping equipment, no explanation for how anyone could have transported heavy stones up a 60-foot ladder. As Maria prepared to extinguish the unauthorized fire, movement in the forest below caught her attention. Shapes were emerging from the tree line, human figures walking with purposeful determination toward the tower's base. Through her binoculars, Maria counted at least 20 people approaching from different directions, all converging on the tower as if responding to some prearranged signal. The figures moved with unnatural coordination, maintaining perfect spacing as they formed a circle around the tower's base. In the firelight, Maria could see they were dressed in clothing from different eras, some in modern hiking gear, others in older outdoor clothing that suggested decades of mountain wear. They stood motionless, faces turned upward toward the beacon fire, waiting with infinite patience. Maria called down to them, identifying herself as a forest ranger and requesting they disperse. None of the figures responded or acknowledged her presence. They continued their silent vigil, occasionally shifting position but never breaking their circular formation. Through her binoculars, Maria began to recognize some of the faces from missing persons reports she'd filed over the years. There was Jennifer Walsh, who'd disappeared while hiking alone 3 years ago. Behind her stood Robert Kowalski, an experienced outdoorsman who'd vanished during a solo camping trip in 2019. Maria counted 6 other individuals she recognized from active missing persons cases, all standing among the silent watchers as if they'd never been lost at all. As the night progressed, more figures emerged from the forest. Dozens of people, representing decades of disappearances in the Blackwater Falls area, gathered around the tower in expanding concentric circles. They watched the beacon fire with expressions of profound longing, as if the flames contained something they desperately needed. Maria's radio crackled with static whenever she tried to call for backup. Her cell phone showed no signal despite being at the highest point for miles around. The beacon fire continued to burn without fuel, its light growing brighter as more watchers gathered below. Maria realized she was trapped in the tower, unable to climb down through the crowd of silent figures. Around midnight, the figures began to speak in unison, their voices creating a low harmonic drone that resonated through the steel framework. They weren't speaking words in any language Maria recognized, but the meaning was somehow clear. They were calling to others lost in the wilderness, guiding them home to the beacon fire. Maria understood that the fire served as more than just a signal. It was a gathering point for those who died alone in the mountains, offering them community in death that they'd been denied in their final moments. The tower had become a lighthouse for the lost, and the beacon fire would burn as long as people continued to disappear in the surrounding wilderness. As dawn approached, the watchers began to fade like morning mist. They didn't walk away. They simply became less substantial until they disappeared entirely, leaving only disturbed earth where they'd stood. The beacon fire continued to burn, waiting for the next night's gathering. Maria climbed down from the tower as the sun rose, her legs shaking from exhaustion and fear. She should report the incident, document the unauthorized fire, file paperwork about the trespassing. Instead, she found herself walking to her truck in silence, understanding that some responsibilities transcended official duty. Over the following months, Maria altered her patrol routes to avoid the tower during evening hours, but she made sure to check the area regularly during daylight, ensuring no living hikers were camping too close to the beacon fire's influence. She began carrying extra emergency supplies and maintained meticulous records of missing persons cases, hoping to prevent more names from joining the nightly gatherings. The beacon fire burned every night, visible from miles away to anyone who knew where to look. Local newspapers occasionally reported sightings of atmospheric phenomena or unusual aurora activity in the Blackwater Falls area, but Maria never commented on these stories. She understood that the fire served a purpose beyond human comprehension, providing comfort to the lost and guidance to those still searching. On quiet nights, when her patrol routes brought her within sight of the tower, Maria would pause, and watch the distant glow. She'd count the figures gathering around the beacon fire, noting new faces among the watchers and remembering the living people they'd once been. It was a vigil she couldn't officially acknowledge, but couldn't bring herself to interrupt. The beacon fire had made Maria the guardian of a terrible secret, but also the keeper of a profound truth, that some duties extend beyond death, and that even the lost deserve a light to guide them home. Each night the fire burned for those who would never again see sunrise, and Maria Santos ensured that their eternal vigil remained undisturbed in the mountains they died trying to navigate. Story 9. David Park had chosen the abandoned farmstead in Tucker County for his research on traditional Appalachian preservation methods. At 29, the cultural anthropologist specialized in documenting vanishing rural practices, and the deteriorating farm represented a perfect example of early 20th century mountain agriculture. His grant from the university provided funding for a month of fieldwork, documenting everything from construction techniques to food storage systems. The farmhouse sat in a narrow valley, surrounded by fields that had reverted to forest decades ago. The main structure was beyond salvage, its roof collapsed and walls surrendering to decades of weather. But the outbuildings remained remarkably intact, including a stone root cellar built into the hillside behind the house, exactly the kind of traditional preservation facility David hoped to study. David arrived on a Monday in early March, setting up his tent near the farmhouse ruins and organizing his equipment for systematic documentation. The root cellar drew his immediate attention. Its arched stone entrance was still solid, though heavy wooden doors hung askew on rusted hinges. A hand-painted sign above the entrance read, "Preserve What Matters, 1923, suggesting the cellar had been built during the farm's most prosperous period. The interior exceeded David's expectations. Stone shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and the temperature remained consistently cool, despite the warming spring weather outside. Most remarkable was the collection of preserved goods that remained on the shelves. Hundreds of mason jars containing vegetables, fruits, and meat that appeared to have been canned decades ago, yet showed no signs of spoilage. David began cataloging the preserved items, photographing each jar and noting the handwritten labels. The dates were curious. Many jars were labeled with years spanning from 1924 to 1987, suggesting the cellar had remained in use long after the farmhouse was abandoned. The food inside looked impossibly fresh, with vegetables retaining their original colors and fruits that seemed to have been canned yesterday. As David worked deeper into the cellar, he discovered it extended much further into the hillside than the exterior suggested. Narrow passages branched off from the main chamber, each lined with more shelves containing preserved goods. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Someone had carved an entire network of storage chambers from solid rock, creating a preservation facility that would have taken years to complete. In the deepest chamber, David found items that made no logical sense. Mason jars contained what appeared to be preserved memories, swirling luminescent substances that shifted and moved within their glass confines. The labels on these jars bore names instead of dates: Sarah's first steps, wedding day joy, Christmas morning 1943, grandfather's last words. David opened one jar labeled Summer Picnic 1956 and immediately experienced a flood of sensations that weren't his own. He could taste fried chicken and fresh lemonade, feel warm grass beneath a checkered blanket, hear children laughing in the distance. The memory was so vivid and complete that for several minutes, David forgot he was standing in a root cellar in 2024. As he explored further, David realized the cellar preserved more than just food and memories. In the deepest chambers, he found people, entire families arranged on stone shelves as if they were simply another type of preserved good. They appeared to be sleeping, their bodies perfectly maintained despite the decades that had passed since their deaths. Handwritten tags tied to their clothing provided names and preservation dates spanning nearly a century. The oldest preserved person was a woman labeled Grandmother Eunice, 1924, kept for Sunday dinners. Beside her lay children from different eras, their small bodies tagged with notations like Billy age 7, 1943, saved for summer adventures, and Little Anne, 1967, preserved for Christmas mornings. David understood that the root cellar didn't just preserve food, It preserved life itself, keeping people and experiences in a state of suspended animation. Families had been using the cellar to save their loved ones from the passage of time, storing grandparents, children, and precious moments like provisions for lean years when happiness was scarce. As David photographed the preserved people, he noticed something disturbing about their arrangement. They were organized not by death date but by intended use. Grandparents were stored together for Sunday visits, children were grouped for holiday celebrations, and young couples were preserved for anniversary remembrances. The cellar wasn't a burial site, it was a pantry for human experiences. David tried to leave the cellar but found the passages had rearranged themselves. Corridors he'd mapped earlier led to different chambers, and the entrance he'd used seemed to have disappeared entirely. The stone walls were warm to the touch now, and he could hear the sound of breathing echoing through the chambers. Not his own breathing, but the slow, steady respiration of the preserved people beginning to wake. A voice called from somewhere deeper in the cellar, an elderly woman asking if it was time for Sunday dinner yet. Other voices began to join her, people awakening from decades of preservation, asking about family gatherings and holiday celebrations that had been interrupted by their storage in the cellar. David realized the cellar's preservation process worked both ways. Just as it had kept the dead fresh for future use, it was now preserving him for whatever purpose the awakening family deemed appropriate. His watch had stopped, his phone showed no signal, and time seemed to have become negotiable within the cellar's stone chambers. The preserved family began emerging from their storage spaces, moving with the careful deliberation of people who'd been sleeping for decades. They welcomed David with the warmth of relatives greeting a long-awaited visitor, explaining that he'd been expected for quite some time. The cellar, they said, had been waiting for someone who could document their preservation methods for future generations. David found himself assigned to a shelf in the deepest chamber, labeled David Park, Anthropologist, 2024, kept for academic purposes. The preservation process was painless, like falling asleep during a particularly comfortable nap. His last conscious thought was gratitude that his research would continue indefinitely, even if no one would ever read his findings. Above ground, spring turned to summer, then autumn, then winter. The abandoned farmstead remained empty, its root cellar sealed once again behind heavy wooden doors. But sometimes, hikers passing through the valley reported hearing voices from beneath the ground, families calling to each other about dinner plans and holiday preparations, academic discussions about preservation techniques, and the contented sounds of people who had finally found a way to make the most precious things last forever. The root cellar continued its ancient purpose, preserving not just food for hungry seasons, but love for lonely times, memories for forgotten years, and people for moments when their presence was needed most. It was the ultimate expression of mountain self-sufficiency, a way to store everything that mattered, so that nothing truly important would ever be lost to time. Story 10. Carol Mitchell had investigated paranormal claims for 15 years, but the hunting lodge in Monongahela National Forest promised to be her most challenging case. At 41, she debunked dozens of alleged hauntings through careful analysis and scientific methodology. But the reports from Dead Man's Lodge defied her usual explanations. Multiple witnesses describing hunters who appeared at dawn, tracked prey through the forest all day, then vanished at sunset, leaving behind trophies that shouldn't exist. The lodge had been abandoned since 1987, when the last hunting party disappeared during what was supposed to be a routine deer hunt. Search teams found the men's vehicles in the parking area, their gear neatly organized in the lodge, but no trace of the hunters themselves. Local authorities eventually closed the case, attributing the disappearances to a tragic accident in the vast wilderness. Carol arrived at the lodge on a Friday evening in late November, during peak hunting season, when the phantom hunters were most frequently reported. The building sat in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, a two-story log structure designed to accommodate large hunting parties. Inside, she found the lodge exactly as the missing hunters had left it. Rifles mounted on walls, maps spread across tables with planned hunting routes marked in red ink, and a trophy room filled with mounted deer heads that watched visitors with glass eyes. What immediately caught Carol's attention were the newer trophies mixed among the older ones. Fresh mounts that showed no signs of aging, despite the lodge being abandoned for decades. Each new trophy bore a brass nameplate with a hunter's name and date, but the dates were all from years after the lodge's abandonment. The most recent plate read, James Crawford, November 15, 2024, with yesterday's date. Carol set up her monitoring equipment throughout the lodge, positioning cameras and audio recorders to capture any unusual activity. Her EMF detectors registered normal readings, and thermal imaging showed no unexpected heat signatures. By every scientific measure, the lodge appeared completely empty and normal. At dawn, Carol heard the first sounds, vehicles approaching on the access road, followed by the slam of car doors and the voices of men discussing their hunting plans. Through her window, she watched a group of 6 hunters emerge from pickup trucks that cast no shadows in the morning light. They moved with purpose, checking their rifles and studying maps, preparing for their hunt with the efficiency of men who'd performed these rituals countless times. The hunters were dressed in clothing from different eras, some in modern camouflage, others in wool jackets and canvas pants that suggested decades past. Their leader appeared to be a man in his 50s, wearing gear that looked like it came from the 1980s. Carol recognized him from newspaper photos as Richard Moss, one of the original missing hunters. Carol tried to approach the group, but found herself invisible to them. They walked through her as if she were made of air, continuing their preparations without acknowledging her presence. She followed them into the forest, watching as they spread out in a coordinated hunting pattern that covered miles of terrain with military precision. The hunt proceeded with supernatural efficiency. The phantom hunters moved through dense underbrush without making sound, tracked prey that left no visible signs, and communicated through gestures that required no explanation. Carol realized they weren't hunting deer or other game animals. They were hunting people who'd entered their territory, tracking hikers and campers with the same methodical skill they'd once applied to wild animals. As the day progressed, Carol witnessed the hunters corner their first victim, a solo backpacker who'd apparently entered the forest that morning. The man had no chance to escape as the hunters surrounded him with practiced coordination. Carol watched in horror as they took their trophy, adding another nameplate to their collection with the same care they'd once used for deer antlers. Carol understood that the original hunting party had never left the forest. They'd become eternal hunters, trapped in an endless cycle of tracking and killing that provided them with a twisted form of immortality. Each successful hunt added new trophies to their collection and new territory to their hunting grounds. As evening approached, Carol realized she'd become their next target. The hunters had noticed her following them, and their attention had shifted from the forest's other visitors to the investigator who'd stumbled into their domain. They tracked her back to the lodge with the patience of men who had infinite time to pursue their quarry. Carol barricaded herself in the lodge's trophy room, surrounded by the mounted heads of their previous victims. She could hear the hunters circling the building, testing doors and windows, discussing the best approach for taking their newest prize. Their voices carried the casual tone of men planning a routine hunt, as if human prey was simply another type of game animal. Drawing on knowledge from her previous investigations, Carol began to understand the pattern that connected all the Appalachian horrors she'd researched. The caretaker's journal, the whistling woods, the impossible room, the preserved children, the trading post's cursed objects, the weather station's death predictions, the midnight guests, the beacon fire, and the root cellar's temporal preservation, all were manifestations of the same principle. The mountains themselves were alive with accumulated human desire and obsession. Every person who died in these valleys with unfinished business had left a psychic imprint that warped reality around their final obsessions. The hunters represented the ultimate expression of this phenomenon. Men so devoted to their sport that death couldn't end their pursuit. Carol realized she had one advantage the hunters didn't expect. Unlike their usual prey, she understood the nature of their existence. They were bound by the rules of their final hunt, trapped in patterns they couldn't break. If she could disrupt those patterns, she might escape their eternal game. Using her knowledge of hunting traditions, Carol began rearranging the trophy room's contents. She moved the mounted heads into patterns that violated proper trophy display protocols, mixing different hunting seasons and geographical regions in ways that would offend any serious hunter. She dismantled their carefully organized gear and scattered their maps, creating chaos in their ordered world. The phantom hunters entered the lodge to find their sacred space transformed into a mockery of everything they valued. Their rage was palpable, but their adherence to hunting traditions prevented them from pursuing prey that had desecrated their trophies. Carol had violated the rules of their game so completely that she'd become untouchable under their twisted code of ethics. As dawn broke, the hunters faded back into the forest, returning to their eternal hunt for prey that respected the traditions they'd died defending. Carol packed her equipment and left the lodge, but not before adding her own nameplate to the trophy room wall. Carol Mitchell, paranormal investigator, November 16, 2024, the one that got away. 6 months later, Carol published her final report on Appalachian paranormal phenomena. The document catalogued every horror she'd investigated, connecting them through a unified theory about places where human obsession had infected reality itself. But she included a warning that few readers would understand, that some knowledge was too dangerous to pursue, and some hunts never truly ended. The hunting lodge remained abandoned, its phantom hunters continuing their eternal pursuit of anyone foolish enough to enter their territory. But sometimes, when other investigators came searching for the truth behind Carol's disappearance, they found fresh nameplates in the trophy room, warning them to turn back while they still could. Carol Mitchell had become the lodge's permanent guardian, using her knowledge to protect the living from joining the endless hunt that claimed everyone who failed to respect the deadly traditions of the Appalachian wilderness. The abandoned cabins of Appalachia hold more than memories. They preserve the unfinished business of souls who refuse to let death end their deepest obsessions. From the caretaker trapped in tomorrow's tragedy to the hunters who'll never stop their eternal pursuit, these valleys remind us that some doors should remain forever closed. Thank you for watching Sir Ravenclaw.